This episode of the Citadel Cafe is brought to you by listeners like you. Visit patreon.com/the Citadel Cafe to find out how you can become a patron and help make this show possible. This is the Citadel Cafe, episode number 478 for Wednesday, February 28th, 2024. My name is Joel Duggan, and the Citadel Cafe is where my friends and I hang out to talk about the geeky stuff that we're into. This podcast is available on all major platforms, including YouTube. Click on that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you're listening. It is a huge help to the show. We're always trying to grow. Joining me this week is my friend Jonny. Some of you may know him better as Pixel Riffs around the interwebs, on Twitter and on YouTube, where he produces Minecraft Let's Play content like the Minecraft Survival Guide and the new Minecraft SOS series. Jonny is also my co-host on the Spawn Chunks podcast. The last time he was on the Citadel Cafe was episodes 451 and 453, back in October of 2022. It's been that long. We talked about the Lord of the Rings of Power. Welcome back, my friend.
Thank you. And has it really been over a year? That's so strange. I feel like I've talked to you much sooner than that. But that's because it was Monday on the other show. Yeah.
2 days ago.
But no. Yeah, good to be back here and not talking about Minecraft, although I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit before we talk about our main discussion today. But yeah, it's nice to be a guest on a podcast again for a while as well, because I'm so used to the co-hosting role that we both take now and having occasional guests on the Spawn Chunks that I've forgotten what it's like to just show up to somebody else's podcast and, you know, not have to worry so much about the production side of things. It feels good, actually.
It's been a long time since I've been just a straight up guest on a show. And I do remember that. There was a couple people within the original podcast community that I was part of, the Frog Pants Network, where fans of that network had started up their own shows, and they would ask several members, maybe we can grab Brian Denaway, or maybe Joel would want to come on and talk about comics. And I remember being interviewed a couple times when I was doing webcomics by other podcasters.
Mm-hmm.
And my gosh, it is nice to kind of just show up and just like, all right, well, you ask me the questions and I can just ad-lib the answers because you're asking me. So like I could probably fill in the blanks. And anything else that I've done, I've always been either a co-host or like with Comics Coast to Coast, I was the line producer. So I was the one responsible for lining up the guests. So there's all this email back and forth and trying to organize schedules and try to figure out who's going to be on and what would make a good fit for the next conversation and all that stuff. And I mean, you and I do a fair amount of prep for the Spawn Chunks because there's news and emails to get through. And then we have like discussions every week. And this show, like, you have to do some homework. Like, you got to watch something, but chances are it's something we're watching anyway. So it's not like you have to like sit down and force yourself to read a book or watch a show you normally wouldn't watch. So it's a little bit lighter. I also like to think that the discussion here on the Citadel Cafe is a little bit more casual than we have on Spawn Chunks. Although we have some fun on Spawn Chunks too.
Yeah, but there's no like news read necessarily.
Yeah.
You're not like recapping snapshots and trying to pass whatever bug reports have come through about Minecraft. Like it's definitely a more casual vibe. And yeah, I would have watched this regardless of appearing on the Citadel Cafe, but we kind of earmarked it early as saying, yeah, we're both probably going to watch this, and it's been a little while since I was on the show. And having recently also been diving into reaction videos on YouTube and a lot of people reacting to the original animated series in preparation for watching this on Netflix as a new release, I think it's been a good time to get back into Avatar and see what other people have thought about it through the years. And there are some reaction series that are as old as like 2008, and like wow. That's early days of reactions on YouTube, so that's kind of wild to me.
Well, speaking of news reads and the geeky stuff that we're into, I have been extraordinarily busy. So outside of discussing Avatar: The Last Airbender, I've not really been into anything. But it's been a long time since you've been on the show. So what have you been up to that's new and geeky?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, Minecraft SOS is the newest thing. We started a hardcore Minecraft server where we've got the mechanic of being able to revive other players. So you can't necessarily revive yourself, but we have these fate coins that are used to spend on bringing people back from the dead if they die, since a hardcore series, in hardcore Minecraft, you usually have one life and then you die, but we sort of want to be able to play together a little bit more, and I'm quite happy that the mechanic existed because I died within the first 2 days of the server being live. But I think it's a fun little series, but of course we'll save most of the discussion for that for the Spawn Chunks podcast. Instead, I want to talk about some of the other stuff I've dipped into lately, because before SOS launch, I was checking out a couple of other survival crafting games that have just shown up in early access on Steam. Enshrouded was the first, and then Nightingale is the more recent one. And they both have kind of different flavors and different takes on survival crafting as a genre, and it's a genre that I think is getting fairly saturated, if not fully saturated at this point, and a lot of people are getting tired of. So when I posted Enshrouded on YouTube, everyone thought, oh, this kind of feels fresh and interesting, and it's nice to see you play other games. And then I posted Nightingale a couple of weeks later, and everyone was like, oh, I'm so bored of this genre of game. So it's clearly not going to be for everyone. But Enshrouded is a third-person experience, whereas Nightingale is a first-person thing. So while Enshrouded feels a little bit more like an over-the-shoulder like action RPG kind of thing, a bit more Breath of the Wildy, and the sort of big open world that it has, Nightingale feels a little bit more like Ark Survival Evolved. You get sort of dropped on individual islands, and you can warp between different realms in this sort of fairy-inspired landscape. And so there's merits to both of them right now, and tragically I don't have more time to look into either because of Minecraft stuff taking over, but it's been fun to explore new things and try out a couple of games I might not have otherwise.
I'm glad you're doing it, because I've had Enshrouded on my kind of short radar for a while, and I've been paying attention to Nightingale, but I think early on I decided it wasn't really for me. I'm not a big first-person melee guy, and so that tends to be a little bit on the back burner for me. And I also find that a lot of times these survival crafting games, for whatever reason, I prefer them to be cartoony. And it might be the Minecraft experience. It could be things like, I think back in the day I watched you play Pixark, and there was other games of that nature. Stardew Valley, I guess, is along those lines, but then also there's another one that was very cartoony that I was looking at a while ago as well. Oh, Palia is another one. Doesn't have any real combat in it, but has the whole like gather stuff, build up your house, and you get all these different things. And I think for me, the hang up for those games is that I always want the building to be better, and I always want more control. Now, Enshrouded looked like it gave you quite a lot when I was watching your video on Enshrouded, and because it's a voxel-based world, they give you like walls and roofs and things that you can kind of put up. But then if you don't like a certain section of it, like you can cut a hole in it, which to me, I thought, well, that's interesting. Like that's different. And so it got some points there. But ultimately, it just feels like the same sort of grind, right?
Yes, and I think honestly, if you're into the building side of things, which I know you are with Minecraft, Enshrouded is probably the better of the two, at least from the beginning. And what I have seen of the preview footage they posted for Nightingale, the kind of Steam trailer for it, there are some really interesting architectural styles that you can branch out into, but a lot of them are effectively like flat panel things that you assemble, sort of like, I guess, what you would do in Satisfactory, but I think with maybe even less of a fine level of control over it. The game is not really focused around building. Building is sort of a means to an end. You have to have shelter, and a lot of your crafting stations work more effectively when they are enclosed in an area with a roof and there's a warm fire and it feels more home-like. So with Nightingale, I feel like the focus is much more on exploration and finding the magic tech tree, and then the customization you can have over individual worlds that you visit thanks to the portal system, which allows you to effectively play cards, like sort of tarot card inspired and like biological illustration inspired cards that let you choose the biome that you're going to, the level of hostility of enemies that are there, and potentially twist one or more other things about the environment. So you can lower the gravity with some cards to allow yourself to jump higher. You can, change up how much loot stuff is going to drop. And there are other things that provide even more fantastical twists to each area. But then, the base building starts off very straightforward, very rustic feeling, And that's where I draw the comparison to Ark, really. It sort of feels like you are building stuff just out of stone and wood for at least the first 10 hours of the game, which is about how far in I am.
Yeah.
And Enshrouded, like you said, has more of a level of fine control. And while the blocks in that game, you start to unlock them as you explore, so a lot of the materials are locked behind quest progression. If you want to step outside of that, the game doesn't punish you for it, except when you run across some more difficult enemies, most of which you can run away from at that stage. So if I wanted to try and, parkour my way to the other end of the map, I probably could. I might not have a great time getting there, but once I was there, I could mine a little bit of sandstone or, whatever other material is out there and bring that home, and chances are there'd be a building block waiting for me there. It's almost a matter of exploration in the same way that Minecraft is, but to get the rarer types of building blocks and the refined stone types and stuff, a lot of those pop up while you're questing.
I don't know what it is about my hang up with those building mechanics in games like that, because I play Satisfactory, and Satisfactory has got the exact same sort of like, you put up a template of a wall. You're not building the wall piece by piece. There's a wall, there's a door, and until the game developers add different textures for walls, you're stuck with whatever is in the game. And I'm wondering if it's just because Satisfactory, that's building is part of it, but it's not the main focus. It's not necessarily, you're not supposed to always make things look pretty. Like it's meant to be manufacturing and making things and moving items and creating those tech trees. That's the main focus of the game. And sure, I mean, building is part of it, and anybody that's creative finds their little niche within Satisfactory. But I for whatever reason, and it could be just because of the sci-fi design of it, like it's not if Satisfactory is not a fantasy world, so I'm not building stone and thatch roofs. You get technology immediately, and in that way, I think those straight lines kind of are forgivable. Like you don't necessarily want to do stuff that's more organic looking in Satisfactory. I think the other thing too is that if Satisfactory has a shortcoming, it's the fact that you want to build things like circles and you're on a grid. Same thing with Minecraft. Like you want to build circles and you're stuck making pixel art circles. And Satisfactory is the same way. It's very tricky to make anything look round. It's possible, but it's not really. It's players finding a way to do something that was never really meant to be done, and then sharing that with the community and how to do it and all that stuff. And it's not difficult, but it's very tedious and time consuming. And you can tell like it's not meant to be part of the game. And so until they add like round foundations or towers or arcs or things like that, it's never going to be a thing. And I don't know if they'll ever do it, because in a way, similar to things like in Minecraft, when players find a really creative solution to a problem, if the developers add a boxed solution, then that creativity seems to be undercut. And then if there was a round tower in Satisfactory, why would anyone build one by hand? Because my gosh, it would take forever. Like you'd be better off just to use the one that they gave you. So I don't know. It's difficult, and it's like it's limiting. It's almost like it's limiting the creativity, even though you're adding more creative pieces to a game that's like built on pieces. But I was looking at a couple of games last time I recorded with Ryan Murphy, and I feel like when I get the itch to play something like Enshrouded or like Nightingale, I'm gravitating towards Dragon Dogma 2, which is more of an action RPG. There's no real building. I like the building of your character. Like you build characters, moves, you develop weapons. There's a skill tree, several skill trees actually, and that kind of stuff is kind of where I'm going. And I think that's the thing that I was missing from Enshrouded was, I know it has some skill trees, but it doesn't feel like the combat is that robust. It's not as deep as something like a Diablo or one of the more in-depth RPGs. And so it's almost like it has like a good bit of everything, but it doesn't necessarily excel at something that to draw in like a very specific crowd. And I do find that a lot of times these, I guess they're indie games or even, double A games, whatever you want to call them, they tend to have a really broad appeal, which means that they're not like running away with any one thing.
Yeah. I'm feeling that from the games market in general right now. But games are in a really odd place because of the amount of emphasis that's been put on entertainment like this during the pandemic and the stuff that's now kind of collapsing in on itself because people sort of overhired at studios and then had to lay off a bunch of people. And yeah, there's a lot of discussion on, timelines that I'm like Twitter timeline and so forth, where a lot of people are just lamenting what the categorization of game development feels like it is, which is either, laid off, waiting to be laid off, or executive. And those are the three positions that you can have in any kind of one games company. But it's interesting to see what still gets made as a result of that. And the action RPG genre seems to be undergoing a sort of renaissance right now and is getting hybrid games, like Enshrouded, which has sort of a bit of everything thrown into it. But Dragon's Dogma does look a bit more like it's a kind of a traditional action RPG, but scaled up to the extent that modern games allow for now.
Are you excited about the Elden Ring DLC?
Absolutely, I am. Are you kidding? I love that game so much.
Yeah.
And the trailer for it looks like more of the same, but that's very good in the case of Elden Ring, because I could have played that for a lot longer. It's the kind of thing that, having most recently enjoyed a playthrough of that with Zloy XP, with whom I do the Hermitcraft recap. He and I played through the entire thing together on stream using a seamless co-op mod that changes the co-op experience from something where other players have to dip in and out to help you with boss fights to something that you can play the entire game together. And there are obviously glitches and bits and pieces that kind of go a bit wacky when you're playing with a mod like that, all community made, of course. But I'm really hoping that the process of updating that mod to include the DLC is a relatively swift one, because I really want to play it on stream with him and either continue our characters or make new characters and jump into a continuation of the story. The funniest thing about it is, from what I understand of the lore, it seems like with other Dark Souls games, there was a certain area of the game you had to reach before you would find the portal to the area that the DLC takes place in. And that would just be a seamless part of the world if you didn't own the DLC, but once you did, you could go to a specific location. And the same seems to be true of Elden Ring, except the specific location is somewhere we didn't even go in our playthrough. And a boss we didn't fight is effectively blocking the way to us going there. So either way, it will be a fresh experience from even before we begin the DLC portion if we revisit that game on stream.
It seems like a game for those that are into it that can be revisited several times. I've seen a number of people that I follow on streams and stuff play it more than once. And it'd be really cool to see you both get into the DLC, because then it's no longer you taking someone else that's new through the game that you're familiar with, where you're both going to be new to the DLC content. And I haven't watched the trailer. I only just became aware of this before we started recording, and I thought, I'll ask Jonny about this. But the screenshots, they look dark and broody, and that's saying something for for Elden Ring, because most screenshots look dark and broody to begin with, but these look exceptionally creepy in some places.
Yeah, there is a character that the community has assumed that the DLC would revolve around from the original teaser image that was published, I think, about a year ago. There is a character who's effectively part of the group of people who constitute the bosses of the default Elden Ring game, and he just doesn't appear at any point in the game. People refer to him constantly, but he's just not there. And you sort of assume that with all of them having claimed the shards of the Elden Ring, and those are the people that you have to go and reclaim the shards from them so that you can become the Elden Lord at the end of the game, that is one absence which is felt throughout the narrative of the game, such as it exists. You kind of have to build the narrative yourself as you go, because the game is notoriously cryptic about how it relays information to the player, and you're sort of meant to dive deeper if you want to really unpick the story and figure out what's going on. But yeah, the fact that there might be some closure on where this person has been the entire time, and like a bunch of presumably pretty epic fights as a result, is enticing to anybody who's played the original game.
Well, if you're ready, I think we can get into talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender. And to kick us off, we have an email from Grandpa Crafter, a pastry chef member of our Patreon page. Hi, Joel and Pix. I love the work that was being done to capture the look and the feel of the animated series. In particular, I was really pleased to see the casting, makeup, and costuming aim to replicate the character's look and sound quite closely. I've been especially impressed with Dallas Liu as Zuko. I think the compromises they've made to compress 20-ish animated episodes into 8 live action episodes has been overall pretty solid. I have a few quibbles about logic here and there, and with the shrinking of over 50% of the story, they're bound to run into some problematic areas. The one area I'm somewhat disappointed with is the writing for Aang. I feel he's rather more serious in the live action than I remember him being, especially in the beginning of the animated series. I think Gordon Cormier is doing a great job in the role, but has been given less to work with than they might have built into the script for a 12-year-old. What do you folks think? So rather than just responding to Grandpa Crafter's email directly, we'll just bounce right into our main discussion of Avatar: The Last Airbender. This is the 2024 live-action series that just released on Netflix this month. I think it was the 22nd of February that it came out. And I took about a solid week to watch the whole thing. We'll have links in the show notes to the IMDb, the wiki page, as well as links to the original animated series from 2005, which, of course, this is based on. And Jonny and I have both seen the animated series as well as the full season of the live action series. So spoiler warning ahead. If you haven't seen the whole thing, we need to be able to talk about it in full. Also, if you're worried about spoilers from a cartoon from 2008, then that's your problem. So we're just going to dive into whatever we feel. Although I have to say off the start, I didn't necessarily feel the need to compare it to the cartoon. I knew what I wanted from the show, but I wasn't sitting there thinking well, this is different or better, because honestly, it's been decades since I've watched the original. I think I watched it through maybe twice. Once when it was really on TV, and another time I think I was working in animation, which would have been right for 2005, 2008. And I would have been watching it maybe at home after that. But I don't think I've ever watched the whole thing more than twice through. And it's been a long time since. How about you? When's the last time that you saw the original?
The original, I've not really sat down and watched it myself for a while, but I have been watching reaction videos on YouTube that have gone through the entire series and have started Legend of Korra and stuff as well, so I feel like it is still fairly fresh in my mind, even if a few moments are obviously left out for the purposes of them not just posting the entire episode to YouTube, right? Reaction channels have to chop up the footage a little bit and only use what is, allowed under fair use regulations. So I haven't necessarily sat down and watched the entire thing, but I'm pretty familiar with the events of the original. And it's really hard not to compare the two of them, because I feel like the live action show is inviting that comparison by how closely they are sticking to the production design of the original characters. That you may as well have used the original characters' costumes and whatnot as all of the costume reference that an art department might draw up for how they want the characters to look in their show anyway. It is remarkably faithful, visually speaking. And I think that's the first thing that hits, and that's one of the things Grandpa Crafter highlighted in that email, is that the production, the look and feel of the animated series is honestly a 10 out of 10. It is the strongest aspect of the show, I think. And while it was never going to nail the comedic tone of the cartoon, because it's still a cartoon, I think they got the good, they got good locations where they're using locations. The costumes are vibrant and stunning, and they've clearly put a ton of effort into making sure the manipulation of the elements, the elemental bending, looks good. And we need to address the elephant in the room, because you mentioned having watched the animated series, and you mentioned having watched this series. Have you ever seen the film?
I have not, and I probably won't. A number of my friends went to go see it when I was working in animation, and they all just basically said that was horrible.
Yeah.
After a couple of people took the hit, the rest of us was oh, never mind. Maybe we won't watch that. What ended up happening, because everybody was such a big fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, and then the movie flopped so hard, when Korra eventually came out, then that was the excited, oh my gosh, this is actually good, let's all get excited and watch this. So instead of going to the movies, people were bringing in episodes of Korra and watching that in the studio.
Yeah. So I haven't seen the film itself, but again, with reaction channels watching through the animated series, a few of them did post a reaction to the movie just as a point of comparison. And I feel like this show was always going to be compared to the movie first because people were expecting a live action adaptation to be bad. And for me, the show is a solid B. If the animated show is S tier, then I think it hits the B ranking on my tier list. It's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than the movie was. I mean, the movie, for a start, mispronounces the characters' names throughout. They even have a weird pronunciation of the word avatar. They kind of say avatar through the entire thing. And there are some pretty infamous scenes in which the special effects just let the whole thing down. Like, there's a scene where the Earthbenders are rebelling against some of the Fire Nation who have them captive, and then there's about 12 of them all doing this kind of synchronized earthbending routine, and then one small rock kind of flies from off camera and hits somebody off camera. Like, you don't even see the impact before the shot has panned over to them. It's like, it's a lethargic pace for the entire thing. And I think the animated series now on Netflix has upped the pace of things. It's made the bending feel like it has impact. And I think, honestly, the show is at its best when it's being like a martial arts epic in the tradition of like wuxia cinema, like kind of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon or House of Flying Daggers, that kind of stuff. There are especially some fight scenes that are standouts in terms of the martial arts ability of the performers. So much of that feels like stuff they have got right. And I think it is telling at this point that the subject we're dancing around is the writing, the acting, the direction, and the characterization, because I think those are the elements that are going to find fault with audiences in a show which is otherwise doing really, really well visually to represent the world it's trying to bring back.
I had the same first impressions. I thought visually it was really well made, high production value. You get sucked into the universe, which is a good sign. Even if you already know what's going on. Like, I know a lot about the world of Avatar. I remember the different quirky animals and the different areas and the water tribes and the air temples and stuff. And just to see it all in live action and see some artistic and, interpretations of that, I was really on board for it. And they kick it off really quickly too with some visual action with a prologue that has an earthbender running from firebenders, doing all kinds of bending. So right away, there's more earthbending in the first 30 seconds of this series than there was in the entire M. Night Shyamalan film. So a lot of people were very happy about that. And I think that maybe the earthbending and the firebending are probably the standout effects. They look the coolest. They have the most impact visually. The water bending, we don't get to see a lot at first, but eventually they make up for it and you get to see some really cool stuff. But I think visually, like they nailed that look. And the other thing that they get points for me originally is that the costuming and the set design and everything have color. It's not Game of Thrones where everything is gray, or another video game where everything is gray with blood on the ground. Like it was a lot more vibrant. And you've got blues in the Water Tribe costumes. You've got, Aang's air temple monk garb is bright yellow, like, and red and has primary colors. And it doesn't feel out of place. It makes sense because if you look at some of the cultures that inspire, Avatar: The Last Airbender, then you've got a lot of bright tapestries and bright colors, bright architecture, and they bring all that in. Before is it the Southern Air Temple? I can't remember which one was destroyed by the Fire Nation, but
it's the Southern one, yeah.
Southern one, yeah. Before it goes nighttime and battle, it's bright. Like it's got these cool warm golds and hues, and it's lots of green around because of where they are in the mountains with all the jungle and the rainforest around. Like it really is vibrant, and very seldom did it look like a digital plate. Like they did a really decent job of having like, this is a set where people are walking around and touching stuff. Like you can touch the ground here and it's actually a proper, soundstage. And then for those big wide sweeping shots, it was pretty seamless for the most part to go between those and close-up shots. And I thought they did a really good job there. I think the standout thing for me, when you're talking about the broader strokes of writing and acting and things, the stuff that caught me off guard in the first couple of episodes was that it's tonally inconsistent. And I say that because I was thinking, hey, like my niece has just turned 11. Like this could be a fun show. It's live action. she's kind of that too cool for school age where cartoons aren't really what she wants to watch, but then this is pretty fun and cartoony and based on a cartoon. So this might be age appropriate. It's TV 14, but like she's 11 going on 21. So it might be okay to watch with, with my sister and her husband. But immediately in that prologue, the Fire Lord burns somebody alive. Like on camera.
I said at the time, he's basically just done a Mortal Kombat fatality on that one guy. Like he just just absolutely roasts him, and it is immediately more brutal than I expected it to be. I mean, even in the alleyway chase leading up to that, we were talking about an Earthbender is being pursued by Firebenders. He takes a ton of like tiny rocks out of the terrain and uses them to effectively blow this alleyway apart. And it's not gory or anything, but the amount of destruction on display at first immediately sets the tone for something that's going to feel impactful. Mm-hmm. But then, they do a really good job of setting up the Fire Nation as out-and-out villains. Then obviously they're going to subvert that with Zuko's storyline. But I think the immediate impact they have with setting it 100 years ago and setting it us up so we see the massacre of the Air Nation, like the genocide of this entire, sect of people and this entire discipline of elemental bending is kind of brutal, but at the same time, it's setting up a more serious tone for the rest of the show, which, you're right, contrasts kind of weirdly with the moments where they try and find humor and where they try and find a little bit more levity. And I think that's them still trying to channel the feeling of the cartoon, where Aang obviously goes through an emotional arc, but he's running away from his problems a lot in the cartoon, and that's the whole reason he's, skipped the last 100 years in the first place, is that he kind of runs away from his responsibilities, and that's what kind of traps him in the ice. And in the show, it's more like he kind of has to go and clear his head. He goes for like a nighttime drive, effectively, to meditate on some of the stuff he's going to have to go through, and then the storm catches him by surprise. So already his motivations feel different, and you're ready for a more contemplative, introspective, inward character. And I think for the main trio, for Sokka, Katara, and Aang, their performances, especially because they're younger actors, they feel very inward, but not in a way that's super scrutable for the audience, You sort of want more of it to come out and for them to express themselves a little more clearly for it to feel coherent, which is the problem with the first few episodes. And I will say, I think it starts really well. I feel like it drops off for me in the sort of middle of the season, and then it ramps back up towards the end and finishes fairly strong. And so my hope is that they are effectively building up these characters, and as the actors spend more time inhabiting those characters and spend more time together and bond as people, not to mention just aging in general and maturing as performers, I think that stuff is going to fade away in the subsequent seasons, presuming they get to do the subsequent seasons. But yeah, I think the early episodes are let down by the sort of exposition-heavy nature of the dialogue, and a couple of shaky performances to begin with that kind of pick up as the series goes on.
So something that I noticed when I was looking it up is that the episodes are directed in pairs. So there's a different director for 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 7 and 8. 7 and 8, I think, are the strongest. That's Jet Wilkinson is the director. And I would hope that if they get more, seasons going, that Jet Wilkinson gets more, and perhaps a whole season to do that. Because I've noticed in other series, like a Mandalorian is a really good example. They bring in sometimes guest directors, or they start off with a different tone, and you get into a new season, you're like, it was fun, but like there was something that was a little bit off. And then you get into like episodes 3 and 4, and you go, oh, that's directed by Dave Filoni. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You like something, you're like, oh, that was Bryce Dallas Howard, and like, oh, that's why that episode was so good. And I can feel the differences, and just like you, I really sank into the mid season where I feel like it just got a little lost. It was trying to do too much at once, and that's where I think the plot and pacing kind of messed with the tone, where like they wanted to keep that jovial, we're on an adventure, so hey, I guess we go this way kind of stuff from the cartoon, and it doesn't necessarily work with the weight that you're supposed to feel from Aang, the guilt that he's supposed to feel from flying away from that air temple. You know, there is a spot I think in the show where he talks to his teacher, and he says, "Look, if you're gonna not feel guilty, if you had been there, you would have been dead like the rest of us. Because at that
Yeah.
time, you were the Avatar, but you were untrained. You were and still are 12. So like there would have been nothing you could have done with the Fire Nation army attacking under Shosen's comet. And so that at least helps him kind of get over that little hump of guilt. But there's just that weight that he's supposed to feel, and then the back and forth with different jokes. And I think that combined with how quickly time passes, like I had a real hard time figuring out how long it was between episodes. It feels like
Yeah.
it's either the same day or maybe the very next day. And so they're starting to make these little inside jokes between the crew, which you get when you have a 20 episode first season and a lot of these personality quirks that you can get away with in cartoons. But when you're fast forwarding through so much and condensing so much in a live action show, and then these characters start making in jokes, she's like, but I I don't like I don't have the camaraderie, or I've not experienced the camaraderie watching this show for you two to be joking with one another. You know, like
Yeah.
the only time it makes sense is Sokka and Katara because they're established early on as brother and sister. So you know they have a history. So if big brother razzes little sister, like it's fine. Like you know you can kind of get away with that. Um, but I think like you, when it comes to the casting and the main three, I was disappointed in a few ways, but ultimately I give them a pass because of in a lot of ways their age.
Yeah.
Also, I felt that the dialogue that they were given to deliver, I don't know that an adult could deliver it any better because some of the especially the exposition in the first two episodes are rough, and the amount of like we have to communicate to an audience that potentially doesn't know what Avatar: The Last Airbender is at all, what is going on, how it's all working, and communicate this through instead of Aang talking it over with Katara and Sokka that would then strengthen their bond. He just kind of talks into the air. There's a really awkward scene at the I think it's at the air temple when they go back to visit the destruction, where he's like staring off into space, talking to himself and moving his head like there's someone in front of him and there's no one there. And there's another two people in the scene with them that he could have turned around and talked to and had an exchange with. Instead, it's this really awkward monologue. And I mean, again, the young actor Cormier that plays Aang does an okay job with it, but it's also just a lot of really clunky exposition that you don't expect. I think the one time that worked well was when they were in the Southern Water Tribe village and they first discovered Aang. They brought him back to the village, and Gran explains to Aang because she has like an inkling of who he might be, and she explains what's happened because I was having this moment of like, I don't really remember. I'm pretty sure there's been like some time has passed because like the technology in the Fire Nation has changed and there's different people are the Fire Lords and I can't remember how long it's been. I knew I had questions and thankfully they didn't beat me over the head with it. They just kind of let Gran explain it to Aang, who's just as confused as the audience, and then she does the dialogue that is the opening of the cartoon. You know,
Yeah.
which it was a little bit ham-fisted, but it did work. Like I thought, okay, well that's a nice nod. That's a nice nod to go with it. They could have actually had that opening in the show. I would have been totally fine with the show opening with the like a live action version of the anime opening. That would have been fine too.
They kind of like they do that after the Fire Nation invades. They have they have Avatar Kyoshi explain what the four elements are and what the Avatar is, and then later on when they're in the Water Tribe, they have Gran's monologue, which is just Katara's dialogue, and that really like I've seen such a split of opinion over how effective people found that because some people went immediately, recognition and nostalgia and the kind of the fan service sort of nature of basically word for word quoting the intro to the show, and people really liked that. And then some people are like, this lady feels like she's reading this off a piece of paper, and she doesn't really put a whole lot of natural performance into it. It really is just a recitation of the intro without it feeling natural. And I kind of see both sides of that. I feel like it's fun to kind of almost name drop bits from the original series. And you're talking about having very little chance to hear the crew bond, but then them having sort of in-jokes and stuff. There is a scene later on in like a bar in the Earth Kingdom, and you're with Iroh and Zuko at this point, so you don't necessarily get too much of it from the main trio, but somebody kind of overhears them talking about the Avatar, or they say, oh yeah, no, the Avatar came through here the other day, and wait, who was telling us about that? Was it the pirates? No, it was the guide who takes them through the canyon. And they're referencing stuff from the animated series that's happened kind of off camera, so they are trying to leave in these nods to adventures happening outside, and the other characters in, effectively the NPCs, as I think of them, like the kind of the side characters and background characters in this show, having some notion of goings on in the outside world that isn't just limited to our main trio. But that unfortunately comes at the cost of weakening the main trio for a lot of people, and I kind of agree with that.
There's a couple of times where they do those little Easter eggs where I found it funny. I don't know if anybody that has never seen the cartoon would find it funny. Or would it feel completely out of place? So in Omashu, there's the cabbage guy, and when his cabbages get wrecked, he almost says it. I thought, okay, that was pretty funny. Like that, I got that reference, right?
They tease the line twice before he actually gets to yell, "My cabbages!"
My cabbages, right? Like screams it up like Darth Vader, no, like that kind of stuff. Which it's cheesy, but like it works because you're familiar with the cartoon. But I would imagine anybody watching the show is like, what is going on? Like, why is this guy so obsessed with his cabbages? And I feel like if the whole show had that tone, a lot of this stuff would sail smoother. But because it's not consistent that way, I find that it comes at like a hard break. It's like you're watching something really intense. There's an intense scene with Aang, or there's like this really cool like Avatar, what's it called? Avatar mode, Avatar state,
and the Avatar state, yeah,
where like there's great crazy special effects. There's a ball of air and stone flying around, and then the next cutscene is something real goofy, and you're like, wow, okay, well, I was really into this for a second, and now you've just pulled me out of it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the dialogue being at times, not all the time, and not for all characters. At times, it feels very Disney afternoon. Like those shows that like Zendaya would have started off with, and not Justin Bieber, Justin Timberlake, like those old 3:30 in the afternoon, like middle school dramas where everybody's just overacting and all that stuff. And it doesn't really fly when you've got other more experienced actors, like the Fire Lord. I'm trying to remember his name right now.
Daniel Day Kim.
Yes, Daniel Day Kim, and then Paul Sung-Hyung Yuriy, who is fantastic as Uncle Iroh, and they're just able to deliver, even if they have goofy stuff to do and say, they can still kind of bring a little bit of whimsy in a subtle way, like they're not overacting, which I think is because, I mean, the Fire Lord is one note for the most part, but it's still believable in this world. Like he pushes it to the edge of camp, but doesn't cross that line, I think. And forgive me if I'm remembering correctly, but I don't remember a lot of the Fire Lord from the cartoon. I feel like we get more Fire Lord in the live action than we do in the cartoon.
This is one of the things that was controversial with fans to begin with, is that you don't actually see the Fire Lord's face in the animated series until Zuko returns home at the beginning of season 3.
Oh, wow.
So the Fire Lord is basically a menacing voice and a silhouette up until that point. And there might be flashbacks that kind of you see like a hand or like part of his face in shadow or something, but he doesn't like step forward into the light and effectively at that point introduce himself as the villain of the show until season 3. His presence is felt, but he's not on camera. And obviously the live action show feels like it can't do that as much. And there are a couple of reasons why. The first of which is that they've talked about it as this is a remix rather than just a straight recreation or a straightforward like one-to-one adaptation. They have reoriented a lot of the flashbacks and a lot of the sequences that deal with characters' pasts, and they've put them in this season where previously in the animated series they appeared in much later seasons. So like we get hints of the death of Iroh's son in book 1 of the animated show, but it's not really covered until the midpoint of book 2, where the characters are in Ba Sing Se, and there are a series of vignettes where he effectively mourns for the loss of his son who was lost in a battle at Ba Sing Se.
Right.
And in the live action show, we see Lu Ten's funeral 4 episodes in, and it's like a flashback from Iroh's perspective, and it's showing some stuff about Zuko's past as well. Likewise, you get Katara's mother dying to firebenders. That isn't shown in the original series until about 5 or 6 episodes from the end in book 3. And then it's effectively the motivation for why the character acts the way she does for the entire first season of the live-action show. And so I'm kind of surprised that so many scenes of characters' pasts and upbringing and their sort of regrets that they're bringing with them were touched upon in this season, and that's part of the more serious tone it's taking and part of the reason why it begins with the genocide of the Air Nation. And my perhaps optimistic projection for what they're doing with this is that they're kind of doing 3 seasons as a past, present, and future. So season 1 of the show is about the characters dealing with the past, which is how come you get Aang going through the journey that he goes on and feeling like he's searching for his friends, but all of his friends are gone. And you'd hope starting to bond with his new friends, but hopefully we'll see more of that bonding in season 2 when the show really twists to focus on the present. And then season 3, if we get that far, will be about securing the future of the world, and that's where the fight against the Fire Lord really kind of comes into the forefront. But yeah, a lot of the stuff in this season of the live action series is flashbacks to stuff that in the animated series we didn't get until much later. And I sort of wonder if they didn't have those plot beats planned out when they originally started the animated series because they weren't certain how much of it they were going to be able to make. And then those characters' motivations have to be thought about in great detail and then written in and sort of retroactively fitted to the character's identity. And they maybe have loose ideas going into it, but the exact sort of outcome of events isn't really decided until book 2 or book 3. Whereas the live-action show knows what happens to these characters in the full arc of what they had in the animated series, so they have that to refer back to, and they can restructure it to a way that they feel makes more sense.
And I think that makes sense to bring people in that are unfamiliar with the original animated series. I didn't mind the flashbacks. I thought giving Katara that motivation and giving Aang that motivation from the past events. Sokka, it didn't seem to have the same sort of weight. I was anticipating him to be more hung up on finding his father as opposed to living up to some sort of disappointment. And again, I'm not so familiar with the original series as to whether that's something his father actually said in the series or whether it's more about finding dad and getting dad's approval because dad's never been around to approve rather than having like disapproval or disappointment from dad in this version. I thought it served the characters, but I think one of the issues that probably happened early on, and now given the structure of the animated series that it's billed as book 1, I don't know whether the animated series was sold as a 3-season arc.
Yeah.
Animation is expensive, and that stuff was hand drawn. So like back then, that would have been a very expensive show to make. And I would imagine at the very least, it would have been like a season of episodes and then an outline for book 2 and 3 to say, hey, if season 1 does well, then we'll start moving on season 2 and 3. And I would imagine that they probably had the opportunity once season 1 was an absolute smash hit to flush out the details and like, okay, well, now that we know we have these 2 other seasons to do, we can work in these flashbacks for Iroh. We can work in these different reasons for Katara's motivation and stuff. I think it might work okay in the live action to have this stuff early on. I thought the reflection of Iroh's funeral for his son and of course the fantastic acting from Paul Sung-hyung Lee really helped me understand Iroh's deep compassion and love for his nephew and the relationship with Zuko. And again, it's been long enough that I knew that he had a soft spot for Zuko, and I knew that Zuko had a rough relationship with his father, but I didn't remember the details of it. And so I was trying to remember, like, why is Iroh such a fan favorite? I know he's lovable, but there's more to it than that. And once I was reminded of the loss of his son, I was like, oh, right. That's why he's so protective of Zuko from an emotional standpoint. Like, Iroh protects Zuko's heart. Like, that's his kind of reason for being around Zuko. He wants to keep him alive, but he wants to keep him from turning into his father, essentially.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really well communicated. And I think that happens. It gives those awkward pauses where it's the old school two military men, one of them a lot older than the other, just not saying "I love you" out loud. But then you get to see the flashback, and so you understand that Iroh loves Zuko, but he's too proud to say it aloud. And he also, I feel like it would probably embarrass Zuko, and Zuko wouldn't know how to handle it yet. So there's that understanding too, right?
Yeah, he has that lovely moment where they get on the boat in the flashback after Zuko has just been banished and they're leaving, and he says, I brought everything I need, all the supplies for my tea or whatever. And then Zuko says, are you really okay coming with me? And he says, everything I need is right here on this boat. Mm-hmm. And then there's a moment where it feels like they're acknowledging the connection between the two of them, and Iroh like breaks the tension by being like, see, all the tea supplies,
Yeah.
And that was the moment at which I think I entirely accepted Paul Sung-hyun Lee's performance as Iroh, because the character feels like one of the most different characters from his original performance and characterization in the show. But then we're also talking about a voice actor who died during the original production of the animated series. Mako Iwamatsu was the original voice of Iroh, and he is absent from most of Book 3 because I believe around the time they were filming the voicing the stuff in Ba Sing Se, he passed away of cancer. And from that point, any voice acting that's done is either archival stuff that they were able to pull, or it's somebody doing an impersonation of his performance. And they felt like they really couldn't include him as much in that. And so it feels like they approached that character with great care and respect, but didn't want to simply carbon copy that performance. And so he feels very different from animated show to live action. And it's, there are little subtle character things, like he still has a love for food. He's got a very cheeky face. He has these sort of little bright eyes that he flashes at people every so often. And it's a very appealing depiction of the character. But at first he feels more like a military advisor to Zuko, like you were saying, the kind of soldier connection that they have. Whereas in the show, he feels like a firebending trainer and a philosophical mentor. And they haven't quite got to that point yet, but I'm hoping in season 2, if it follows the arc of book 2 of the show, where they sort of effectively become refugees in the Earth Kingdom and try and go off the grid for a while, I'm hoping that he gets more of the philosophical, poetic stuff out of the way. Because there are glimpses of it in season 1 of the show, but you don't really get the full force of what it was like having Iroh around to offer you jasmine tea and, the right word at the right time.
Yeah, you get hints of that once Iroh realizes, I think it's General Zhao's assassination attempt on Zuko.
Yeah.
And like, I feel like, again, the show rushes through that. Like, you see some worry on Iroh's face, but you think he would be completely broken.
Devastated, yeah, right? Like he's lost another one at that point.
And then you see him in other situations where he seems pretty composed, but then you find out in a different scene that that Zuko's alive and dressed up as a Fire Nation soldier with a mask on, so he can't be discovered, and he's on the boat, and Iroh knows he's alive. And you're like, oh well, that explains why he's so calm. But like, we missed the scene where Zuko revealed, "Hey, I'm not dead," to Iroh.
Yeah,
you know, like they glazed over that.
It feels like that was either something that was left on the cutting room floor and shouldn't have been, or they simply didn't plot it into the episode, which feels like an oversight.
Yeah.
And there are a few connecting threads like that I miss, and it comes down to even small things like there's a fight in the marketplace in Omashu. This is going back to episode 3 here, where Zuko confronts them and Aang says, "No, leave this to me. I'll take care of him." Katara and Sokka go off and save the Machinist, and they have a fight where it starts off in this empty square that Zuko has presumably kind of cleared out by, intimidating people, and there's just nobody around. And then it cuts away from the fight to, I think, a scene with Sokka and Katara, and then it cuts back to Aang and Zuko fighting, and they're in a completely different location. But we haven't seen them leave the location, we don't see them enter this location, and it feels very disjointed in that sense. It just kind of feels like they wanted to pick up here and put us back down there without showing us how we got from place to place. And I think that also kind of feels like how the overall show goes, where we sort of jump around a little bit. There are a few transitional moments as they're flying on Appa from place to place, but I think sometimes everything just feels like suddenly we're here without much explanation of how we got there. But I still love that fight. The fight in Omashu is probably the most Jackie Chan it gets in the entire thing, where they're like prop fighting. Like Aang has a basket and he's using it to block Zuko fighting him with a stick, and he's throwing plates at him, and then a lady comes out of nowhere and just like bats him with a fan because he's knocked into her stall or something. And like that's a moment of comedy in the middle of an action scene that works because it has that Jackie Chan feel to it, where he would inject like a comedic moment into the middle of a fight. And half the time the way they're fighting is inherently funny. And that's the point at which it felt like, without even using any of the bending, it felt like the tone of the show was back for a brief moment, because it had the sort of humor injected into the middle of an action scene that you're still like, the action is great. And like there's little glimpses of brilliance throughout that I feel like are kind of capturing the spirit of the show, like lightning in a bottle for a second, and then it's just released again and we move on to the next thing that doesn't quite land.
Yeah, that happens whenever there's a decent firebending fight. There's a lot of, I want to say, that flow of energy. They all talk about it, whether it's a firebender, waterbender, airbender. They all talk about reaching out with energy. I think Aang talks about it a lot with Katara as he's kind of encouraging her to get in touch with her feelings. It's very Star Wars, actually.
Yeah, feel the energy, be in balance with your surroundings,
exactly.
That whole thing, yeah.
And it happens a lot in the movements, which I think is what makes the fight scene so great, is that for every strike, there's at least one windup or two.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a bunch of moves that you're like pulling, like Aang has to pull in a bunch of energy before he whirls around and releases it in a kick or a spin or a flip or something that ends up like blowing air or a focus burst or levitating something, whatever he's doing. And I love that nature of it. Earthbending is a lot of that too. There's a lot of like stomping and reaching into the ground before you pull up, and then you have the boulder in front of you, and then you can push it towards the enemy. And I think they do a really good job of having the shots be wide enough that you can see usually the person's full body. So if someone's stomping and spinning like Aang, granted he's not very big, but you're not just seeing him standing from the waist up whirling his arms. Like you see him like sweep his leg. It's very deliberate. Like my foot goes here and then it goes out to the side, and then I move my left arm and then I do a whoosh and then everything happens. And I really like the way that they do that. It's very much like a dance. And as with any action sequences in shows and movies, that they're obviously very heavily choreographed. And this feels like that, but in a way that makes sense, partially because of the world where bending is the fighting form, but also just the nature of crowded spaces. Like when they do those kind of fights, like in the market or the top of battlements in a wall, like when Zuko helps Aang escape and they have to fight all the different Fire Nation guards, and they're dealing with like closed spaces, like closed corridors or tight battlements on walls, and things just make sense. And you have people coming up on ladders, and Aang's like, well, that was silly of you, and kind of like blows the ladder over, like, puts a puff of air in the guy's face, and the whole thing just tips over, right? Stuff like that. And there was another one where it's in the trailer where Aang jumps up and you can sort of see him like summon a bunch of energy, and then he lands and does like, a superhero landing where he punches the ground, and then everybody on that battlement just kind of goes flying off the wall. He completely clears the space to the point where Zuko has to hang on.
Yeah.
And because I think at that point, Aang doesn't even know it's Zuko. He's still got I can't remember
The blue spirit
blue
mask.
spirit
Yeah.
mask. Yeah. I liked that when they got into the blue spirit stuff, again, it felt very quick, but once they got there, I felt that Zuko kind of came into his own. You got to see more than the one side, because the first two episodes, Zuko is a cartoon character. He is one
Yeah.
note, which is angry, get the avatar. That's the only thing
Yeah.
that ever comes out of his mouth, no matter what he's saying.
That's Zuko for most of the first season of the animated show as well. So like I think they paced it well, giving him room to grow in the later episodes of the live action show.
But then it turns into vigilante. Like then it's Batman and Alfred, which is Zuko and Iroh, right? And that's when I think their relationship really takes off, because then Iroh is starting to see the sparks of Zuko not wanting to necessarily please his father, but more like prove his father wrong.
And he's capable of doing the right thing at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a difference there, and you get to see more of that, specifically in the final two episodes when they're fighting and going at different aspects in the northern water tribe. I can't remember the name of that city, but it's a big fight over two episodes really. One is the prep, and then the final episode is the big fight, and that the season finale is pretty much one giant action sequence. There's a couple of soft moments, but most of the time it's pretty hard hitting. And I thought that level of not fear but pathos, like there was a lot at risk. People are dying, and people that had like speaking roles and stuff that you thought, oh, that person was cast, and then they don't make it. And you're like, oh, okay, there's real peril. Fireballs are coming in and blowing up the walls, and people are falling screaming to their death. And like, again, it's one of those things where like this tonally feels like what I wanted the whole show to be. And there's still some poignant moments. There's a great conversation between Hakoda and Katara where she's arguing for the fact that, women are not allowed to waterbend, or they're allowed to waterbend, but they're not allowed to fight in the southern, northern water tribes. And there's a great conversation there where she actually goes and gets the other women in the community and brings them back to say like, hey, we're losing this fight, but you've got a couple dozen waterbenders here that are very capable of helping, and you stuck in your ways just won't let them help. And those were really good moments, and they didn't feel too forced. Again, the pace was a little bit much because you don't get to see Katara go talk to them. She just kind of disappears and comes back, and they all have just agreed to follow her, I guess. So there's moments like that I think were good, but I don't know how well they were earned within the context of the episode. You have to kind of read between the lines to get there. And the action and the waterbending that happens in that final episode as well really help illustrate like the power, because for the whole season, and I'm curious to see how you feel about this. You really feel like the firebenders are kind of the better benders. The earthbenders are kind of turtling in, and you can't get in because it's all rock, and they can't necessarily burn anything, so the Fire Nation can't burn their way in. But there's no real contest when it comes to firebenders. Everybody just seems to have their butt kicked, with the exception of Aang. And it was cool to see the waterbenders in the Northern Water Tribe do these massive moves, like icebergs that are coming out of the water to stop the ships from getting too close, and these giant, almost serpent-like water waves that are lashing the giant fireballs from the ballistas out of the air. Like that, I thought was really cool because it showed that there was a real contest between the waterbending and the firebending.
Yeah, and I think what you're seeing is each of the nations after 100 years of war. And it's the kind of thing that it's easy to gloss over because we haven't seen 100 years of history. We've seen 100 years ago, and then we've seen now. But you look at some of the depictions of nations elsewhere, you look at Omashu and you think about the Earthbenders turtling, and it's like, yeah, they've been under siege for 100 years, effectively. Mm-hmm. And it's not been an active siege, but it's been sort of like a war of attrition. And you find that they all end up sort of jaded from the experience, right? And that's where, like, Boomy as a character, for example, entirely different from the animated show, and I think the character lands at a really odd point where at that point in the show, aside from Katara and Sokka kind of agreeing to help him and accompany him on his travels, everyone's been really mean to Aang because he disappeared for 100 years, and everyone feels real hard done by about that because they've had to endure 100 years of war. And when you meet Boomy, he's obviously like old and cracked like he is in the show, but he's also jaded and mean. And at that point, it feels like Aang is looking for his friends and just not finding them. Even Avatar Kyoshi, when he sort of contacts her spiritually in episode 2, is incredibly harsh with him. And especially considering he's 12 years old, it feels like a lot of these adults are being incredibly mean to this 12-year-old kid. But I think you see the impact of war on these nations a lot more clearly than you did in the animated series, because the tone of the animated series was lighter and goofier. And I think one of their mission statements with this show is to bring it more into the realism territory, where obviously people were very concerned when they said, oh, we're planning on making it something that's going to appeal to people who like stuff like Game of Thrones. And everyone immediately thought, well, they've ruined it now because it's all just going to be violent and there's going to be nudity or something. I don't know what people assumed. But, like, you hear Game of Thrones now, and I feel like television producers will throw out that phrase without recognizing the weight that it carries in a negative context instead of just television spectacle. People think, well, Game of Thrones ended really badly and did a disservice to the books in a lot of different ways and is associated with a narrative that felt very unfair on a lot of the characters that we wanted to root for. And now you're doing that to this show where Aang is like a bundle of joy when he's not being confronted with some of the harsher aspects of life. And they confront him with the harsher aspects of life quite quickly in this show, and it feels like it doesn't even let up on that until they get to Roku. And then that changes Roku's characterization to actually being way more jovial than he is in the animated series. But I think that's, a more realistic notion of how war would change the entire world if you have been at war for 100 years, and every nation is involved in that. And every nation has seen the destruction of the Air Nation and think, maybe we're next and we have to concentrate on defending against that. So that puts the Fire Nation on the offensive, and that makes them feel like the most competent people there, because they're the ones who have the power to act, and they're the ones who have this history of having wiped out an entire nation of benders. And at that stage, they're going to feel like an overwhelming force. And so it sets it up quite well for that siege in the north, where you see the waterbenders fighting back, the tables get turned on them, and then obviously spiritual stuff intervenes at that stage. I think one of the other major things that has changed about Aang's character from the cartoon is that he has a sense of direction in the cartoon, but it begins with, like we were saying, that avoidance of responsibility. You know, the first thing he does when he gets out of the iceberg is go and ride some penguins. And then he talks about all of these different animals that he wants to visit the different nations and ride. You know, I want to go ride a giant fish. And in the show, they have him struggle with avoiding this sense of responsibility, but they don't have the cartoon logic of him riding a giant fish. But then that sort of lessens the impact of the season ends with him inhabiting or letting the spirit of the ocean, who is a fish, inhabit him. So it sort of inverts the whole thing from the beginning of the show, where it's like he wants to go and ride a fish. Well, now the fish is riding him, and now the fish is mad, and now the fish is going to cause a tidal wave that's going to sweep all of these boats out into the ocean and overturn all of them and stuff. And so there are some things which feel like they lack the setup to become poetry later, I think, is one of the problems with the writing and some of the stuff that I won't say that they've changed from the animated series, because you can't recapture everything, but there is symbolism in some of the way they structured events in the animated series that I think is not replaced by anything new in this show. And I struggle sometimes to find the overall theme of an episode in this show in the way that it feels like this show should have a theme, like a strong theme for an individual episode, or a message, or like a moment that the characters have learned or grown through. I think episode 6 is probably the best at that, because the theme is about... The episode is titled Masks, and it's the one where Zuko shows up in the blue spirit mask, but it's also about what people conceal and why and that kind of thing, right? But I feel like there isn't that strong sense of theming throughout each of the episodes, so it's kind of difficult to pin down exactly what the show is trying to say at times, and sometimes it feels like it's not saying anything.
Did the ocean spirit thing happen in the original cartoon?
Yes, absolutely, okay. It did.
I remember. Yeah. I remember the moon, and I remember the ocean spirits, but I couldn't remember exactly what happened and when. And because of the pace of the live action show, I was like, why are they pulling something from book 2 that I don't remember at all? And so I found it a little bit confusing. But the thing that I think that they did well in Legends, like in that North and the Legends, the episode 7 and 8 with Aang specifically, was they definitely communicated the weight of him taking on this ocean spirit or letting it take over him, and then the destruction that it caused. And you definitely feel Aang feeling terrible about killing Fire Nation people. Like he really he wanted to keep the Fire Nation from destroying the city, but he didn't necessarily want to wipe them all out. And I feel like that balance of like bringing that back worked, as far as there was something else. Well, it was the air temple. It was the Southern Air Temple in episode 2 when they bring Aang there, and you can feel his guilt and his horror at the genocide that happened there. And then you get his anger where he gets into the avatar state, and he's like he can't control it. And so Sokka and Katara are in danger. And I feel like that was a good mirror, where it was his friends that ended up in danger in episode 2 because he couldn't control the avatar state. And then he's trying to then save them and keep them safe in episode 8 by letting the ocean spirit take him over. But in the process, he goes too far the other direction. So to protect these few people that he's trying to protect in the Northern Water Tribe, he ends up massacring, or I guess I shouldn't say Aang, but the ocean spirit ends up massacring a lot of Fire Nation people. And so he goes from like uncontrolled one way to uncontrolled the other direction, and realizes that both extremes are not what he wants. Like he wants to have a balance in between. And I did pick that up. Like I thought they did a decent job with that. I find that the arc that they put Katara on, I think, is probably the most appealing to me. And I don't know whether it's because of the flashbacks that we get from, what episode was it? I think it was Spirited Away. Whenever they go to the spirit world and fight Ko, the creepy centipede fear monster.
In the animated show, that's something that happens in the North. Like Aang goes to ask Ko how to find the two spirits of ocean and the moon. So they've changed that a little bit, and they kind of make it a my friends are captured and I need to go and find something that I can bring back to rescue them. But yeah, like in episode 5 they touch on Katara's flashback, but you've seen it a couple of times already before that, and I think I don't know if it's actually in episode 1, but it definitely shows up when she's talking to Jet in episode 3.
Yes.
And so you sort of get the full version of it in episode 5 when they're being shown visions in the fog.
I thought that they did that sequence really well. Like that, I thought that the spirit world was interesting, and Ko was terrifying. Like that was really creepy. That had that had Shelob stuff written all over it.
Voiced by George Takei as well. So great to see him still getting incredible voice work.
And there's something very old school about that, like that mask flipping, like that single eyeball. I've seen it in things like Spirited Away, and even the old Mainframe cartoon. Hexadecimal was the bad guy. I can't remember where that was.
Reboot?
Oh, Reboot. Yeah, Reboot.
Yeah.
What was the name of the woman that was the villain? Was that Hexadecimal? I can't remember.
Maybe.
She had the masks.
Yeah.
She's creepy because she didn't really have a mouth. Like she just kind of spoke kind of omnisciently, but then she would change her mask, the theater mask, to be angry or happy, and even the happy was creepy in kind of like a Joker way. And that, like any kind of thing like that with the mask flipping, I find very odd. there was like those kabuki masks and different things that they do in anime sometimes when it's a silent character that just kind of like cocks its head sideways, staring through a silent mask. It's like it's real for me. I find it very odd and unnerving. And I thought that they nailed that kind of exchange. And I was disappointed that the resolution there didn't have more exchange between Aang and Ko. Aang just kind of shows up and leaves a little talisman, and then everybody gets released. You almost expect like a Cheshire cat or a Alice in Wonderland caterpillar exchange to kind of like for Aang to either outwit or barter or do something than just like a simple gesture. So I was hoping for a little bit more, but I think it was more that I wanted more from Ko. Just kind of like the performance and the visual aspect of it was just really really well done.
The character is very, very compelling, but they seize the opportunity to expand on the lore of Ko a little bit when he goes to see Avatar Roku, and Roku says, "I stole this totem from Ko, and it's a totem that represents his mother, who is the mother of faces." And from what I gather, that's a detail that they added later in books or comics or kind of, supplemental material for the animated series. So they are trying to work in aspects of the world building that hadn't even been originally created for the animated show. And so I think there's an extent to which some of that can like show respect for the broader world building that's been done around the series. But I think you're right. I think it was kind of a shame to see it resolved so quietly. I think there's voiceover or something happening at the time, and then Katara and Sokka are just released with no negotiation happening or anything.
Yeah.
But I think at that point, the stakes of that episode have already been dealt with. It's sort of like why they don't do the scouring of the Shire at the end of the last Lord of the Rings film, is because like the conflict of that episode has already been resolved. You don't necessarily want to come back to resolving another conflict, sort of this domino effect of people getting what they want.
While we're talking about things that are positive about the series, I really like that they cast culturally appropriate people to reflect the different tribes and cultures within the Avatar universe. There are quite a few indigenous actors of various roles from the southern and northern water tribes. Obviously, there's Chinese actors and other Asian actors. Paul Sun-Hung Lee is South Korean via Canada. And then you've got actors like Amber Midthunder, who plays Princess Yue. She was in Prey, that latest Predator film. That's her in that film.
Oh, is that her? Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Because, like, I hate to say it, I thought her performance in Avatar was kind of a passable one. She's really good in Prey.
Very good.
And I think the thing to blame is the wig. I feel like in most of the time, obviously she's meant to be a very kind of put together character, and there's a bit of commentary on that in the show about how she has to be like just so and be very meek and everything, and she just wants to be like herself around people in private. But I feel like she couldn't really move her head very much because the wig was like a whole piece. It felt very like fixed and the kind of thing where you don't want to move too much, otherwise you're going to jostle something and then you have to spend another hour in makeup. But yeah, no, I'm very surprised to learn that was her. Wow, it's quite a transformation, I feel like, from the protagonist in Prey.
Well, there's not a lot of dialogue in Prey either.
It's true, yeah. She's mostly kind of out there talking to herself and her dog.
I thought she was pretty good in Avatar. I think the thing again, it's the dialogue, and it's also like the scene direction, like that moment where she's trying to explain to Sokka, like I understood what she meant, but she doesn't finish her sentence. Like she just says, I'm supposed to be, and she kind of like softly gestures with her hands and tilts her head. And it's like, but you could do more in this scene with dialogue and communication and acting to really convey what she's supposed to be. And it reminded me of, it's going to make me feel old, but it reminds me of watching a really young person, like Gen Z or younger, describing something where they just don't actually finish their sentences.
And kind of tail off mid-thought, yeah.
I feel like there's a couple spots like that in the show where it's like, well, I wanted more from that. And I feel like in some ways, some characters maybe just lucked out. Like Katara doesn't do that. Katara generally speaks and says what she's feeling and is able to articulate it. And Sokka, not so much. Like I feel like Sokka is another character that unfortunately has a lot of hints or is supposed to do a lot with looks, but then the looks are like held too long or they're too cheesy or like that kind of stuff doesn't seem to be as prominent. But yeah, there's a lot of other really good actors in it as well. A. Martinez plays Hakoda. For folks that remember, we talked about Longmire on the Citadel Cafe a long time ago, and he plays Jacob Nighthorse in that show. And he's so good as an antagonist in Longmire that I had a real hard time swallowing him as a good guy in Avatar.
Yeah.
Like he is such a smooth talking villain that when he starts to get a little abrasive with Katara about like being set in his ways and that women don't fight and all that stuff, that you want to, by this point, you really like Katara and you want her to succeed, but then you just like, this guy is just in her way and he's really ruffling my feathers the wrong way. And you're like, God, I don't like him. But then he redeems himself through dialogue later on because he apologizes to Katara and says, thank you for showing me, and I've learned a lesson from you, young master, that kind of thing, which is a really cool moment for Katara. And again, a nice positive thing about the show. But my past experience with Martinez is just like, I don't know if I believe you, you silver-tongued evil. No, wait, no, different character. So I find that, in a way, he's so good at being the villain in Longmire that it was hard for me to shake, that nature. But I think that one of the things that the show did well is, with the exception of Iroh, Firelord, and I guess that's it, there's really not a lot of recognizable names in the cast. It's a lot of new people. And I think you kind of have to go that way. It's like the original Star Wars. Like basically everybody in that cast was unknown. And it meant for a wide range of acceptance and like, this is just how it is. This is who they are. And we're going to move forward from here. And I think that for me, I am most interested in following this show for whatever they do with Katara.
Yeah, I'm the same, and mostly because I didn't like the place they started with Katara. And I can recognize what they're doing. Like on an intellectual level, they're clearly giving her more of an arc. They're building her from somebody who can barely waterbend at all into somebody who is actually saving the world by waterbending by the end. But I feel like her personality is lacking, and that's a symptom of comparing it to the animated show. But Katara is always kind of hot-headed in the show, and it allows her to juxtapose herself against the attitudes of the Northern Water Tribe, Sokka to a certain extent in the animated show as well. Like, it allows her to prove herself in a way before she even encounters any kind of opposition. She's already kind of bossy and motherly, and that's as a part of it, basically them having to grow up without a mother. She sort of becomes the mother figure for herself and Sokka, and then just for the team. And you don't get as much of that because they're starting her off very meek and underconfident, and having her confidence grow along with her abilities. And that's something they've said that they're doing in interviews. So as long as it is a conscious choice that they're making, and the character's going to continue to grow in confidence even into season 2 and beyond, I'm fine with that once we see the overall picture of it. And I think maybe Katara was a difficult needle to thread because obviously online people share opinions about female characters not feeling like, how they want female characters to feel a lot of the time, and she was potentially going to come under fire if fans found her too annoying, especially if they were newer to the series. And diehard fans are going to miss the argumentative nature of Katara, but newer fans might just think she feels bossy, and people have an unfortunate desire to take that out on the actor instead of recognize that it's a choice as a character and might be down to direction and writing and the characterization that the overall team has figured out, and not just the individual actor's performance. It's the difficulties of being a female character actor with the internet around. But I struggled at first because there were fundamental parts of her character missing, which they seemed to want to build in as character things that she picks up as she goes. Literally, in one case, she doesn't get her flask of water that she carries around so she can waterbend at people until episode 4. Before that, she's kind of looking around for creeks and fountains and stuff that she can waterbend out of. And while it's a cool character moment to see her realize, oh wait, I should carry this with me and then I can waterbend at people wherever, it does sort of feel like logical thought and the notion of you being a waterbender in the first place, you would want to prepare for that. Now, she's grown up surrounded by water, so maybe the thought never occurs to her until she feels like she is without it. But you start to see the character innovate in the section where they're running away from the Fire Nation and she's firing ice discs at people, and later she says, I picked that up from watching Earthbenders. And it was at that moment that I started to see her character turn from somebody who was just learning the ropes to somebody who was improvising, and it felt like a natural extension of her abilities instead of just something she could do. And I think that's really how you get from the place where she is underconfident in the beginning to the point where she has to fight Master Paku in the North Pole, and she actually surprises him a couple of times. And I thought the effects kind of suffer when it comes to waterbending and ice, because so often those are difficult things to render correctly.
Yeah.
There's light refractions and stuff that have to happen. So some bits of that fight looked a little bit weird. And anytime somebody is sliding on ice, it sort of feels like hit and miss whether or not it lands, you know? There's also one point earlier in the series where Sokka does like a knee slide on some ice Katara's put out for him, and it feels a little bit like Tenacious D cheesy, but like I don't know if that quite lands. But I think her fight with Paku actually turned out great, and the reason I like that so much is because up until that point, it really didn't feel like they were using her for the martial arts scenes at all. Like, Aang gets some good fights, Sokka gets some good fights. You don't see what Katara is physically capable of until she's put in a position where she has to be challenged. And in the show, they're challenged much earlier, and it feels like there's a much more of a collaborative defense of the team happening that Katara is a big part of. But I feel like you don't always see that in the live-action show until much later, to the point where her and Sokka are basically sidelined for half of an episode when Aang goes to get the totem from Roku and rescue them from Ko. And I feel like Katara is the character who feels most different from her cartoon counterpart, give or take maybe Boomy. And I think I want to see more of her growing into the character and the actress, you know, being able to grow in her camaraderie with the others, and hopefully that comes across when season 2 begins. Because sooner or later, they're going to have to introduce Toph. And I feel like if Katara isn't hard-headed by the time they meet Toph, Toph is going to bury her. So I do feel like she needs to reach a point where she's at least matching that energy for it to really feel like a relationship can form between the two of them.
I really felt that Gio Antio, which is the actress that plays Katara, came into her own, I think, in the second half. So in the same way that the character feels kind of stilted and unsure in the first half, I also feel like her acting got a lot better in the second half.
Yes,
because I think she had a lot more to draw on and deal with and pull from, I think. And I'm excited to see where it goes. I do remember Katara being harder headed, in the cartoon, but I can't remember whether that was later seasons or early on, because I'm pretty sure that it's Sokka is supposed to be 16, Katara is supposed to be 14, and Aang is like 12, right? Like that's the rough dynamic of the ages, right? And I saw that what they were doing with the whole motherly thing when they introduced Katara to water healing, and how she said like, "Well, I've heard about it, but I've never actually seen it done." And then that's when it's revealed to her that, well, that's the only thing women in the Northern Water Tribe are allowed to do, is basically be healers and potentially builders. Maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of ice wall defense and support and repair and stuff that happens. So I don't know whether they are part of the people that built it as well, but it's unclear. And I like that for her, where she's kind of like taking bits and pieces and kind of making it her own. But I'm curious about Toph. Toph is one of my favorite characters from the original, and
100%.
Yeah, I really hope that they can nail that in a way that doesn't feel cartoony, because Toph has got so many one-liners and kind of like dismissals of the other character. Like, no one is safe on the crew, and if that's not handled with the right timing, it's gonna feel really after school special. You know, it's gonna feel it's gonna feel really stilted. So I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes. But I'm looking forward to seeing more. I have a lot of, I think, complaints about it. The biggest thing for me, and I think we might disagree on this, but Ken Leung as Commander Zhao, I couldn't stand him. It was, this could just be subjective, but it was like nails on a chalkboard. And again, I'm not laying it all on at his feet. It could have been how he was directed. It could have been the dialogue being, again, really wooden and obvious for him. But there's just something about a mustache twirling bad guy in a cartoon that does not work as live action. And it was around episode 6, I think, when it was a really heavy Zhao dialogue episode, whenever Aang is captured. And there's a lot of him basically monologuing as a villain and explaining his whole plan and revealing everything. And I honestly stopped. Like it took me 3 sessions to get through the whole episode because I just got so.
Oh wow!
I just got eye-rolly bored. I ended up checking my phone. It's really one of the things I use to measure how engaged I am with a show. If I end up being on my phone, then I'm out of it. And I think a lot of it is that like he's spending all this time, in my opinion, terribly delivering this information that I already know, because it's already been communicated by hanging on him for like 4 beats too long as he looks almost right at the camera. It's like, I have received word from the Fire Lord or from Azula or whatever, and he finally reveals it, because we've seen through Azula's cuts with the scenes back at the Fire Nation capital that that she's the one pulling the strings and doing stuff. And so when he explains it to Aang, you're like, we already know this. It really rubbed me the wrong way. Right up until I found even the dramatic scene with Iroh and him in the, I guess it's like a koi pond, like the special spiritual place where the 2 fish from the moon and the ocean spirits take physical form.
Yeah, the sort of mystical oasis that they have there, yeah.
He goes beyond even for him there. Like, it's really manic and over the top. Like it reminded me of the other cringy performance, which was Boomy, which I didn't like at all.
Yeah.
They really don't feel like they fit with what they were trying to do. Again, like you've got this epic battle and these big stakes, and then you've got this cartoonish delivery from Zhao in that session. And again, it's totally subjective. I think for me, I really didn't like it.
I fall completely in the opposite camp on this one. I thought Zhao was great because in the cartoon, he's a cookie-cutter villain with some good moments, but not a very fleshed-out character. He's very much just like, haha, I got the upper hand now. And in this, he's politically manipulative, opportunistic, ambitious, and weaselly. And it's a much more interesting character, a more dynamic character, I guess. Like, he doesn't just kind of show up and commandeer a situation the way he commandeers the ships. It's like, he's there from earlier on. He's kind of a nobody, and just through listening, which is sort of the lesson Iroh is trying to teach Zuko in that episode, he just kind of picks up on information and capitalizes on it in a way that shows the ambition of the Fire Nation creeping into other people than just the Fire Lord. And it doesn't necessarily set up the ending super well, because the way he comes upon the information is a little bit different, but the idea that he has to be the villain of the arc, it kind of runs counter to your expectations in both this and the cartoon, because you're expecting Zuko to be the villain, and then Zuko kind of backs off a little bit, and they have some confrontations, but he's clearly not going to catch Aang. He's just like, going to continue to chase him throughout, and then somebody else has to appear to be the villain for the arc, so that you kind of take Zuko off the hook from being that, and you don't have to introduce the Fire Lord so early. And so that's where you get a character like Zhao, who kind of comes out of nowhere. And in this, it feels like he's more integrated into everything. And I'll give you that the performance isn't going to be to everybody's taste, because he is chewing the scenery. I feel like he comes into this show of people doing fairly kind of earnest, like, by-the-book performances, and he does something akin to what Alan Rickman does as the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where he just kind of comes in and goes, I got a take on this. Let me show you my take on this. And he comes in and does like a Christopher Walken performance, like he's kind of like, he's very sly and sardonic, I think, in a lot of ways. and cowardly at the same time. And it shows a side to the Fire Nation that isn't just brash and overbearing. It's opportunistic, it's weaselly, and it's trying to find any cracks in the opponent that you can exploit. And I think that's a really interesting thing. It goes back to the Game of Thrones idea of let's make things a little bit more politically mature in this, 100 years worth of war where, some people are trying to end it and some people are just trying to get out on top. And I think that works for the characterization of Zhao, if not necessarily the performance. And I like the performance well enough. I think it definitely contrasts with a lot of the other performances in that there is stuff there to talk about more so than there is just, finding a line delivery that works. And I think there's a little bit more to Zhao. Maybe a repeat watch would help. Maybe you'll just cement your opinion in, how much you dislike it and just brush it off. But at least at that point, he's dead at the end of this season. So you don't need to worry about him anymore.
We think so anyway. I think it just might be like a little overacting where it kind of shuts me off. And some of that could be like the expectations. Some of it could be like wanting the show to be better and realizing there's a couple of things that are pulling it down. It's certainly not as bad as the wooden dialogue in the first couple of episodes. Like I feel like by the time we get to those later episodes, even though Zhao isn't to my taste, it's better than the really stilted table tennis that happens where it feels like some of the younger actors are just reading a laundry list of lines that are in the script as opposed to talking to one another and actually having a conversation. It just feels like, well, this is where Aang says this line and then Katara says this line, and they're written in a way where like, yeah, okay, sure, that gets the information across, but that's not how people actually have a conversation. Those are two separate sentences that just don't feel like they are in a response to the one that was just read before. And at least with Zhao, he has that level of flow where even if it's not to your taste, at least it's all consistent throughout the whole thing. I think for me, we've had a couple of Game of Thrones comparisons. I would prefer him to be a little bit closer to Littlefinger, but at the same time, he's not smart enough to be that close to Littlefinger, right? So like I get that he has to be that cartoony villain that thinks he's one ahead of everybody, but ultimately is his own worst enemy, and it ends up kind of like shooting himself in the foot.
I tell you whose other worst enemy it is that you don't necessarily pick up on this at first when you're thinking about it, because he's the villain of the arc, which means he's directly opposed to our antagonists, right? He's the one who's going to mess things up for Aang and the gang, but he's also the antagonist of Zuko's story. And that's interesting because Zuko is aligned with the Fire Nation, same as Zhao, but they are working at cross purposes, and Zhao keeps thwarting Zuko's ambition. And so it allows Zuko's arc to shine a little bit more, that they have a villain who is working contrary to what Zuko wants and trying to like supersede him at every turn, capture the Avatar when he can't, and so on and so forth. And I think there's room for that in this story. And it, again, highlights Zuko's arc a lot better. And I think Zuko is one of the better characters in this this series. To the point where I almost consider Zuko like almost another point of view character, right? Like he is effectively a secondary antagonist, or a secondary protagonist, whose story is happening in parallel with Aang's, and occasionally they intersect, but you sort of see Zuko's journey as one that's inevitably on a collision course with Aang, but for the better instead of for the worse. And there's a few things they're setting up like that already. Along with the Fire Lord, we're also seeing Azula, who is Zuko's sister, who we don't see again until the end of season 1 in the animated show, but in this, the Fire Lord is actively setting them up to be rivals. Like, with Zuko out of the picture, he is needling at Azula with stories of Zuko's successes, even though he still considers Zuko a failure, and pushing her to be this deranged perfectionist that she, ends up being. And she ends up kind of cultivating that, but the Fire Lord is the one who's pushing her to do it. So we see a lot more of the political machinations at home from stuff like that. And I'm not entirely convinced by Azula yet, but that's mostly because we haven't seen her in any action scenes. We've really seen her like fight a couple of people, and then she does a couple of like interesting firebending techniques that don't really get fleshed out until later. But in the animated series, she shows up and immediately starts fighting, basically, as soon as they show her in season 2. So I do hope she gets more range in season 2, and I hope her friends get some range as well, because May and Ty Lee are just people in costumes right now. they've had very little chance to show their character, even if they've been working on how the characters are supposed to feel. So yeah, I'm hoping that we get more of that in season 2, and if it follows the arc of the original series, we definitely will.
Ty Lee is the chi blocker, right? That's, if I remember.
Yes. Yeah, and May has like a throwing knife kind of ninja vibe to her. And they look very different in the animated show. They're drawn very differently in kind of almost different animation styles or illustration styles, whereas they can't do that level of, angular features and whatnot in a real person for the live action show. So right now they feel kind of samey, but that's only because they haven't really been given a chance to act differently in a scene and to show how they are different and demonstrate their different abilities.
Ty Lee, I remember from the show being like super cute, but then also lethal because she can basically end your bending experience because she can like block your energy and all this kind of stuff. And then May, I remember from the anime being like super emo, like really, like almost depressive, like really, like it was as close as they could get to like sociopath in a kid's cartoon.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene with her and Zuko where she kind of goes, "I don't hate you," and he's like, "I don't hate you too," and they're just being emo together, and it's great.
I remember that now.
And I wonder how much of that energy is going to be preserved as they kind of develop that relationship as well. But on the subject of relationships as well, it feels like for the moment, simply because of the actor's age, they are shying away from developing too much romance, with the exception of Sokka's character.
Well, yeah.
And like you see early inklings that Aang and Katara could be a thing in season 1 of the show, and obviously that develops much later. But I can't imagine putting 12-year-old Gordon Cormier into a scene and saying, "Okay, you're supposed to look attracted to this person that you've effectively just met and started working with on a professional level." And so I'm hoping that while obviously that's an element that's missing from this season, and it feels like a loss because they had to rejig the tunnels thing into the Omashu episode, and instead of being a potential love story between Aang and Katara, it becomes about sibling love between Katara and Sokka.
Yeah.
I feel like they are still working around the limitations of working with younger actors and steering things into a situation where, with a few more years under their belt, they'll have a bit more of the performance chops they need to pull off that romantic stuff.
Well, and Gordon Cormier is the closest to his character's age because he's currently 14. He would have been probably closer to 12 whenever they filmed this.
Yeah, like he would have been like 12, 13.
Yeah, but then Katara is 14 in the show, and then Kyo and Tio is 17, 18 almost in real life.
The guy who plays Zuko is currently 22 at the time of this recording.
Same with Sokka.
A bit more of a mature performance as a result, I think.
I found there's a couple spots with Sokka where, because he's supposed to be such a young character, it's probably because I'm watching this in 4K on Netflix, when there was a couple of scenes in the very bright white areas in the southern and the northern water tribes where you really can see how much makeup they've put on the actor that plays Sokka to cover up his 5 o'clock shadow. It's like, what? Is he wearing lipstick? Like, he really looks pasty, and it's because they're probably trying to make him look a lot younger, right? Because he's 22 playing a 16-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking forward to more from the other characters, because I love the Avatar world, and despite my, the things that I feel are not good about the current live action series, I've also seen other shows that have gotten a lot better. Like I remember liking the first season of Stranger Things, but it was the season 2 where everybody's like, "This is the best show in the world." Like it really took off, and I think they will have enough feedback to say, okay, well, we now know what we were doing right, and we now know what we were doing wrong. And I feel like a lot of these cartoons used to do this as well. Clone Wars is a really good example of something that starts off very kiddie. You know who people hated in Clone Wars? Ahsoka.
Yeah.
Ahsoka did not land well when she was initially created in Star Wars, and now she is a fan favorite.
Yeah, and the star of her own show. And
I think that there are opportunities here, as long as they're not squandered, to course correct a little bit and maybe bring this just a little bit closer to the spirit for the characters, but also the tone. I think really the biggest thing for me is if they correct the tone, and I don't necessarily need it to be serious. I just need them to be consistent. If they're going to be silly, then the whole thing, like you said, needs to feel like an over-the-top Jackie Chan movie. And if they're going to keep that level, then they need to hold it throughout the whole thing. But if they're going to have these somber, serious moments, then I think they have to dial down the cartoony, cringy jokes and the timing and go back to more like Lethal Weapon kind of buddy cop stuff from the 80s. That's where Toph would come in really well with like one-liners and like she's going to be like the Murtaugh, you know, she's going to be the old grumpy, get off my lawn, you bunch of amateurs. That stuff I think is going to be really interesting because correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Toph have a thing for Aang even though she never admits it?
I mean, Toph kind of has a thing for everybody.
No, but I mean like like a crush on Aang, like romantically.
I don't know if it really comes out that way in the show. Like she has like moments of that kind of blushing sort of like, oh, you saved me or whatever, and then like there's a couple of comedic bits where like she thinks it's somebody and then it's somebody else and she's like, okay, I'll just stay here on my like tiny square of dirt now. But I don't know if she has a crush on Aang. In Korra, where they develop a bit more of like what the characters did as adults, like she ends up with multiple partners. She has daughters from like various different guys, and so I feel like she kind of goes wherever the wind blows.
Right.
It seems like. But yeah, I don't know if she, strictly speaking, has a crush on Aang. If there is elements of that in the animated show, it doesn't last very long.
I wish they had done better with the pacing for Sokka, because I do remember Sokka having some love interests in the show and that being a really interesting character development for him in the cartoon. Whereas the pacing here felt so rushed, like he feels like he's head over heels in love with two women in the course of 2 days.
That's just the nature of the passage of time not being easy to convey when they've got 8 episodes instead of 20, right?
And I really liked the actor Yvonne Chapman who played Kyoshi. I thought she did a really good job, especially with the spots that were supposed to be awkward, because she's this like sequestered, never seen a boy. Like it's her whole life has been about duty and fighting and being prepared for the war that's so far eluded them, but could land on their doorstep at any moment. And so when she flirts with Sokka, she beats him up and then looks at him like, wasn't that cool? And he runs away like, that hurt, bye. And she was like, what did I do wrong? Is this not how you flirt with boys? And I thought that was really, really well made. And the way that, I mean, she looks really cool as well with the awesome makeup and the costuming and whatnot. Again, it's one of those situations where the cartoon actually translated quite well to the live action, and having the brighter costumes and the brighter set pieces made the bright red eye makeup work. But you really got to see the subtlety of Chapman's acting when she washes off the makeup and she has a real interaction with Sokka where he decides to let the bravado down and let her teach him how to fight in their style. And that was, again, one of those good pacing moments, but then it's all, I feel like you get moments like that in the show, but then you're like, well, crap, I want more of her, but we've already moved on. Like all of a sudden it's like, we're no longer in this phase where I feel like that could have been 2 or 3 episodes. I would have been cool with seeing that aspect of it. And I don't know why it's such a short season. Cause I mean, if anybody's got the pockets for a big production, it's Netflix, right?
Well, you'd say that, but I can see where the seams are in their budget. Like, there's a few moments where the effects don't quite line up. I think one of the only places where the look of the show suffers is where they've really obviously shot some scenes like in the volume or against a green screen. There are some moments, I think it really stands out to me the most in the Spirited Away episode where they're in the forest, and they could very easily have done stuff like that on location, but the backgrounds are so artificially out of focus that it's really obvious they're standing in front of a screen. And like the lighting isn't right. Yeah. And there's so many kind of like moments like that where once I start to notice some of that stuff, it's one of those can't unsee things that takes me out of the immersion of the show. And that's really unfortunate. So I kind of hope that maybe they do a bit more location shooting in the next season if they can, or maybe they're able to just like move on from that visually, or even like if the budget improves or something, they can just tighten up those sections where the cracks begin to show. I know a lot of people have had issues with the obvious like digi-doubling of the characters when they have to do any more complicated movement. And there's a couple of scenes that really stands out to me, but for the most part I bought it, and it was just when I started to notice the transitions between them. There's a scene at the beginning, I think, of the final episode where they all kind of take on a Fire Nation ship, and then they jump back on Upper, and then like one of them does like a little twist as they jump over the side of the ship, and it's so obviously the moment where they become digital.
Oh yeah.
And it just feels a little unfortunate that they highlighted that movement, and then it was very clearly the transition, the seam between the two shows. But then yeah, these are all like little nitpicks, and I do think as a show in its own right, it stands up. It's not the strongest show, especially when compared to what we have seen in the past, but I think it's got all of the right pieces. They maybe just need to be put together in a slightly more coherent fashion. You talked about Kiyoshi very briefly, and I know Suki as a character, as Sokka's love interest even, comes back in later seasons, so we're going to see more of that actor anyway. But the fact that they had more of the previous avatars, I think, is a really interesting part of this. You get glimpses at Kyoshi and the previous two avatars in later seasons, but season 1 really has the encounter with Roku, and that's it from the original animated series. So I think it's really cool that for a start they introduced Kyoshi earlier than they introduced Roku, and then they still had Roku anyway, and then you also got a scene with Avatar Kuruk at the North Pole, and you establish this mechanic of Aang can only really talk to these avatars when he's in their shrines, like when he's in a place where they are revered. And that lends an interesting spiritual dynamic to it, whilst also explaining why he can't just manifest Avatar Kyoshi anytime he needs to fight anybody. It's not just like a move he can do. But I think it shows a respect for the show's history and the world building that they've established. They even have a statue of Avatar Yang Chen, who is the previous Airbender avatar, in the air temple at the beginning before the whole thing is destroyed. And so that's also a legitimate reason why Aang can't maybe contact Yang Chen until maybe they visit one of the other air temples in future. And you don't get to see those avatars except in minor scenes where they just show the lineage that the avatar has had previously until way later in the animated show. So I'm curious if they plan on incorporating that more in future seasons, or if that's just something that's, again, grounded in the past of the show, if they're dealing with that in season 1, and then season 2 is going to focus more on what's happening in the present.
I have to correct myself, actually. I meant Maria Zhang, who plays Suki, in terms of the subtle acting with Sokka. I said Kyoshi, but I meant Suki. I remember looking this up, and they really buried Maria Zhang in the IMDb list. I couldn't find her.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, that's who I meant. Any final thoughts to wrap up? Looking forward to season 2? Like what direction do you hope they go in?
I mean, definitely looking forward to season 2. I think this show was always going to work for me if it did two things right. If it got the bending looking good, and if Appa was good. And this is an aspect of the show that I haven't touched on yet hardly at all, but as somebody who has an Appa plushie, like literally 3 feet from me, it's on top of one of my speakers in my office, I love that Sky Bison so much, and from the original series, and obviously it was another thing that people had as a negative against the movie, was that they just didn't make Appa look good, whether the CGI just wasn't ready or the creature design just didn't quite match up with the original. But I could not see Appa on screen without having like an involuntary kind of reaction, because he was just so adorable. Like the scenes where he's just kind of like chewing the air a little bit as he flies, and there are so many good moments. I really wish he was in the show more, because he's clearly their conveyance. He's how they get from place to place. But in the animated show, he's sort of in the background of a lot of scenes, just kind of being eye candy almost. And so I definitely want there to be more Appa in future, but I think that's one of the aspects that made me think this show's going to be okay. Like it's not necessarily going to change the world, but it's going to be decent. And I think they nailed those aspects of it. The visuals are stunning. I think if they can keep that but build on the foundation they already have established with these actors, I'm expecting the main trio to be like the Harry Potter kids.
Oh, yeah.
They all got better over the course of 8 movies. Some of them have gone on to shine in other roles since. I'm hoping for great things as they mature as performers, as they get more experience and get used to each other's company. I'm hoping that they just get to do the entire story, because that's the only point I think at which we'll be able to truly judge whether they've done the story justice.
I agree with the coming of age nature of the show. I feel like if they look at what they've done and they take the positive feedback and lean more in that direction, then I think it will be something worth watching. I plan on continuing to watch it. It's not something that I dismissed as like, well, that wasn't for me. I like the escapism. I think they really excelled at the world building, the visuals. I agree with you on Appa. I think Appa and Momo were both pretty good. There's a little bit of weird seams with Momo when Momo got hurt in like the final episode, where like he really didn't feel like he had any substance. It felt like Sokka was holding a stuffed animal with no stuffing in it.
It also felt kind of gratuitous. It was like a cheap excuse for them to get to the Spirit Oasis, and I'm like, what, you gonna have the cat get a serious injury now? Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, and I think that in a way, having those animated characters that are mystical creatures that you can't tell me that is or isn't how a lemur would act, because they don't, like, those, that kind of thing doesn't exist. So you can't tell me what a sky bison is going to do. And I feel like if they wanted to lean on those characters for the comedic relief and lighten up the jokes from the main cast and get some of the more dry, one more beat before they cut to a different scene from, like, a grumble from Appa or it's stuff like that, I would be more on board with that level of humor in it. And I mean, I'm on board to see where they go with it. I'm very curious to see how a lot of those other characters develop, the ones that we mentioned earlier, like Ty Lee and Azula. We only scratched the surface with Azula, so I don't know whether that actor is going to blossom in the way that we hope, because I don't think she had a lot of room to do much other than just like angry stare at the camera. So I'm looking forward to seeing where they might take that kind of stuff. It was enjoyable enough for me. I am actually interested in going back and watching the original now, because it's been so long, and refreshing my memory as to how much I enjoyed that. And also, I think it could help me maybe forgive some of the goofiness or the humor of the current live action show by just reminding myself that the original had some really cartoony moments and some really awkward kind of one-off episodes that were total fillers, that were just, they barely progressed the story, but they were just meant to be like goofy. This is for the cartoon kid section, And so I'm hoping that by going back and watching some of the original, that maybe I'll have a slightly more open mind when it comes to watching season 2.
Yeah, I think, honestly, I come away from this with the same feeling I had about Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, which is that I enjoyed the experience, and for the people who didn't, if it encourages people to go and revisit the original if it's not their first time seeing it, or if it encourages new fans to the property to go and seek out the original if they haven't seen it before, then that can only be a good thing.
Moving on into the Internet Minute, brought to you by you, dear listener. The Citadel Cafe is 100% listener supported. If you're getting value out of the show, please consider putting a little bit of value back in. You can become a member at patreon.com/the Citadel Cafe. Joining at any level will get you an invite to the member-only Discord server and access to the Barista Cut bonus audio, which is the extended version of the podcast. Special thanks to our bean counter patrons, Cosmic and Smurf588. Thank you very much for your support on this episode. Patron count is at 25, which is down 1 from the last time we recorded. Our goal each time we record is to add 1 more patron. If you would like to be patron number 26, visit patreon.com/the Citadel Cafe. I'll keep this short and sweet because this Lego set is not out yet. This is the Medieval Town Square, coming on March 1st, so a couple of days away, but it was a few weeks away when I first added this to the notes. And it is 3,300 pieces, retails for 300 Canadian, which is a lot, but actually not a bad piece count considering the price tag. Normally retail ends up between 18 and 20 cents a piece, and this is more like 10 or 12. So that's pretty good. There's no real dimensions because it consists of several minifig scale buildings, market stall, horse buggy, other interiors, that kind of stuff. There's an inn. And so you don't really know how big it is until you've probably put it together. Plus, it's kind of modular. Based on the Lego Castles Medieval Market Village set from 2009. So it kind of goes back to Lego redoing and revisiting some of their original castle builds with the newer pieces and newer building techniques that are available today. Some of the buildings are open back, and some of them appear like they might close up on a hinge like some of the old school castle builds, but it's not really clear from the images right now on lego.ca. So I reserve my judgment there. I prefer things to be in the round. If I was going to build like a blacksmith shop or a little inn, I would much prefer to have it be a 360 build rather than something that has like an open back. Feels more like a play set than a model at that stage. It's not on my list. It's not something I'm going to go out and buy because I don't have any medieval builds on display. I'm more of a one-off icon or sci-fi Star Wars kind of Lego guy at this point. However, seeing as you're on the show, this is some quick, fun, and easily translatable inspiration for Minecraft.
It absolutely is. Yeah, I've looked to Lego sets for inspiration in the past, and by no means for the final time. This looks like a really cool set. Honestly, this reminds me of the kind of Lego I grew up playing with, but this is what I imagined it looking like in my head as I was building something that looked a lot more blocky. The refinement to Lego in recent years has truly been kind of astounding, and so it's kind of like I look at this and think, surely this is what I had when I was younger, but no, it absolutely wasn't. I feel like in the past, whenever we've had the Internet Minute and I've been on the show, I've always brought something related to whatever the AI is doing recently. And it turns out these days the AI is trying to take over the world of commerce and put people out of jobs. So all I'll say at this point is support artists.
Yes, 100%. There are a number of ways to do that. And I saw a meme recently that outlined a number of ways that you can support artists for free, which is just like their posts, bookmark them, comment to say how good it is, to encourage them, whatever it is that you want to do to engage, because that is one way to help boost their stuff on those algorithms and try to get it in front of more eyeballs. And that's the name of the game. Like if you're trying to get an artist's work out there more, then statistically there's a higher chance of someone supporting them financially, which is, again, of no charge to you, but down the line, somebody ends up buying something.
Absolutely. Support those folks because they need it more than the computers do at this point.
Well, that wraps up this episode of the Citadel Cafe. You can get more information about the show and links to some of the things that Jonny and I talked about at thecitadelcafe.com. Music for the show was composed by Kevin MacLeod, and you can email the show at thecitadelcafe@gmail.com, just like Grandpa Crafter. Subscribe for free on all the major podcast platforms. That includes YouTube. The RSS feed is on the website, and word of mouth is the easiest way to support the show. As I mentioned before, it's free. Tell friends about the Citadel Cafe, like it, and subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform. It costs you nothing, but it gets us out into more ear holes, which is our goal. My name is Joel Duggan. You can find everything I am doing online at joelduggan.com. That includes a link to the Minecraft podcast that I do with this guy, Jonny, on the Spunchunks. That's at thesponchunks.com. You can follow me at Joel Duggan on social media and Joel Duggan on Twitch, where I stream 3 to 4 days a week. Minecraft on the Citadel server, and currently I'm building the Polaroid one-step camera on my Lego Let's Chat Fridays, and that's coming up this week. So looking forward to finishing that up. Jonny, thanks so much for being on the show, man. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been great. I'm going to shamelessly copy-paste my plugs from the Spawn Chunks podcast, so anybody who listens to that show is going to find this eerily familiar. My name is Jonny. Online I go by Pixelriffs. You can find most of what I do at youtube.com/Pixelriffs, where the Minecraft Survival Guide is currently in its 3rd season, and I just launched Minecraft SOS as another series. I also stream 3 days a week on Twitch, where I do behind-the-scenes work for a lot of my YouTube stuff, and I'm actually going to go and play some Minecraft Bingo a little bit later, so that's going to be fun for today. I'm the voice of the unofficial Hermitcraft recap, recapping all of the goings-on another major Minecraft server that's a lot of fun. You can find that through a quick search on YouTube, and aside from that, if you want to look me up elsewhere, I'm at Pixelriffs on both Twitter and Instagram.
You've been listening to the Citadel Cafe, where we are fast, easy, and cheap, but you can only pick 2. Yip, yip.